Have you ever dreaded going on a particular trip? Have you ever wanted to never, ever, ever return to a particular place or experience? I remember very clearly as a child, every time my family was headed out to visit my Uncle Chuck and Aunt Fanny, I'd get a headache. Aunt Fanny was not a pleasant person, God rest her soul. She had spent much of her life being jealous of her sister, my grandma. Aunt Fanny was actually my great aunt, but we didn't call her that. Aunt Fanny had always wanted to have a lot of children. Her sister, my grandma, had 11. So Aunt Fanny took every opportunity to belittle my grandma and any of her descendants, including me. At Grandma's 80th birthday, we got her a pantsuit. You don't understand. She had never, ever, ever worn pants before that day. But let me say this, she was really styling in her pantsuit. Someone had left a pack of cigarettes on the table between Grandma and Aunt Fanny. And when they came back and picked up those cigarettes, Aunt Fanny turned to Grandma and said, "I thought those were your cigarettes, the way you're dressed." That was my Aunt Fanny. Not a pleasant person. And it was never a good trip when we went to see her, God rest her soul. We all have people who rub us the wrong way. We all have people we do our best to avoid. Well, Hannah from the Bible was no different. Both she and her rival Peninnah were married to Elkanah. But Peninnah had sons and daughters, Hannah had none. And every year, when the family would travel up to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, Peninnah would make fun of Hannah and ridicule her because she couldn't bear children. Nice lady, huh? And it would break Hannah's heart every year. She dreaded making that trip. She dreaded being around Peninnah. People can be so cruel. And back in a time when having children was like basically the main purpose for taking a wife, there was a lot of pressure to produce offspring. And there was much sadness and disappointment when a woman could not bear children. I don't know about you, but I am so glad we've grown in our understanding of human reproduction. There are so many alternatives today. Michelle Obama admits in her new book that she had a very difficult time in that department and suffered a number of miscarriages. And it wasn't until they went through in vitro fertilization that she was able to have those two beautiful daughters. And she admits by writing about it, she's just trying to open the conversation so that women don't feel alone in their pain and in their grief. And perhaps that was Hannah's situation as well. Poor Hannah. It's not difficult for us to envision how this all plays out. Because during the year, chances are Hannah and Peninnah lived in separate tents, probably well distanced from each other. They don't eat at the same table, but on that annual trek to Shiloh, they must travel and eat all together. And when the sacrificial meat is eaten, a portion is given to each wife. And it says, Hannah receives a double portion. But Peninnah is given enough for herself and her children. I can just hear Peninnah cruelly taunting Hannah. "Oh, Elkanah, my dear husband, what a lovely large piece of meat for me and all my children. Oh dear, well, what nice little pieces you have too, Hannah. On this particular trip to Shiloh, Hannah barely makes it through the meal. But somehow she fortifies herself against Peninnah's cruelty, her remarks, and her actions. But then she's had it. After eating and drinking, she hurries off from the family to find her way to the tabernacle, where she pours out her soul to God. She prays silently as Eli, the priest, sitting by the doorway, looks on in interest. He watches her, and her shoulders are heaving, and she's probably swaying a little bit with great distress, and she's weeping bitterly. But not hearing her words, Eli jumps to the wrong conclusion. He's assuming she's been celebrating a little too much, and that her happiness is inappropriate drunkenness. So he rebukes her. He rebukes her drunkenness, and he instructs her to give up this kind of drinking. She explains to the old priest that no, she hasn't been drinking. She's praying for a son. And if she had a son, she would dedicate him to God. She would give him back to God, to live his days in service to God. Well, fast forward, you know the rest of the story. She becomes pregnant. And it says, after she weaned her son, still very young, right? She took him back to the house of the Lord at Shiloh and gave him into the care of that same old priest, Eli. Now, had it not been for her agony and the adversity in her life, the birth of her first child would soon have been forgotten. But her years of agony and her tears of distress make the birth of her son Samuel an incident to be remembered. And they form the backdrop for that psalm of praise which she sings probably. And it has become a comfort and inspiration to folks all down through the ages. And even Mary, the mother of Jesus, was especially mindful of that psalm of Hannah because she echoes it in her own prayer and song before the birth of Jesus. So I want you to just kind of step back and just think of this on a human level. Can you imagine what Hannah is going through? Waiting all of these years to have a child, maybe losing child after child, and then it finally happens. And what does she do? She gives the child away. She gives the child away to the service of God. And when she does, she offers a thanksgiving psalm to God. And it's interesting because in that psalm, she lifts up some of the same themes that Jesus lifts up in his own calling. The lowly will be lifted. The powerful will be made low. God will bring a unique sort of justice where those who have very little will find joy, and those who have too much will be empty. Hannah knows because she's gone through the very experience she's describing in her psalm. She had felt worthless, alone, ashamed, and ridiculed. But then God opened the possibilities around her, and she was filled with joy. What a difference in her life. What a difference in our lives when we gain a new perspective, huh? Even in the midst of having very little, we find joy. God often leads us to a new perspective. Jesus empowered the powerless in his life and ministry. He took those who thought they had nothing and no one, and he created family and meaning and community and the joy of serving. I don't know why I'm thinking of my grandma this week, maybe because Thanksgiving's coming up. But when I was young, we lived on Grandma's farm with her for a few years as my folks tried to kind of get some traction in the job department. And just up the hill from my grandma, within a stone's throw, Emma and L.G. Sager had their home, little farm. And like Grandma, the Sagers had very little in terms of worldly goods. But every day, Emma would walk through Graham's place on her way to work at Aronson's egg farm, about a mile away. But you would have thought that she was heading for a party. There was always joy in her step and a smile on her face. Every day she would holler hello and give a big smile. And she always had time on the way back home from work to stop and visit. Now picture this. She was, for those of you that are old like me, she was almost a twin to Minnie Pearl. In fact, she even hollered the same way. Howdy! She was quite a character. But she had next to nothing. And yet she was one of the happiest people I've ever known. One day, Mom told me her story. It seems that Emma was a very lonely woman who had tried to find love and had finally given up on love and resigned herself to spending her life alone. She had long given up any thought of love and marriage, and then along came LG. He was 30 or 40 years older than her, but he loved her. And she fell head over heels in love with him. And she never had a bad day again. We used to go up to their place, and even though it was basically a tiny kind of clapboard cabin, it obviously contained a lot of love. She used to sit me down, sometimes even on her own lap, at the keys of a broken down piano, and she gave me my first music lessons. In the midst of very little and a life of struggle, she found love, and then she gave it away so that she could brighten up the world around her. She made an impact on my life. She was the positive to my Aunt Fanny's negative, God rest her soul. In the midst of emptiness, God touched Hannah's life with joy, and her response? To give it right back. To give it right back to the world, to give it right back to God. Now that's just the opposite of what you might expect. I can imagine a very different scene. I can imagine someone who's waited that long for a child becoming an extremely overprotective mother, a helicopter mother who finally has a son and never lets him out of her sight. But Hannah receives that blessing and releases it just a short time later. Isn't that a great lesson for Thanksgiving? It's not the amount of blessing you receive. It's how you give it back. Now, in our culture, we're conditioned to protect and keep as much as possible. But Hannah teaches us a new way, and I think Jesus teaches us a new way. Think of those moments in your life when you have felt deep blessing. Chances are those moments come after difficult times or even times of loss. It's when we allow ourselves to feel vulnerable that we are most open. Hannah had deep difficulty and pain. And in the midst of that difficulty and pain, she received the greatest blessing she had ever known. And instead of clinging to it, she gave it away. And as a result of that, Samuel, her son, became a great prophet who was instrumental in restoring the integrity of the priesthood and kept those religious traditions alive while Israel was under the occupation of the Philistines. He also helped bridge the gap between the judges and kings. He brought Saul in as the first king, followed by David. Samuel is an honored prophet within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All because Hannah received a great blessing, and in her thanksgiving, she gave it away. I think Hannah becomes for us a model for how we ought to share our blessings with the world, and you know this is true. with a world that desperately needs a few blessings these days. Amen?